before we get underway, while you're seating yourselves, a couple of housekeeping items. Please silence your cell phones, but don't turn them off. We want you to be a part of the conversation, and we encourage you to tweet your comments and photos at #HumanMachineTeam. Today's event could not be possible without the support of our underwriter, Esri, and we want to thank them for their support. Thank you. You're going to hear more from them in a moment. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Suzanne Wilson Heckenberg. She's the Chief Operating Officer of INSA, to give us some opening remarks and to introduce Esri. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniela, and good evening. I hope you all enjoyed the networking reception. As many of you all may know, INSA is a nonprofit committed to bringing government, industry, and academia together to solve practical and creative solutions for the national security community. We are pleased that INSA, in collaboration with Government Executive, Defense One, and Esri, can bring you this conversation this evening. I wanted to get a hands raised here this evening to see who has attended a Human Machine Team panel in the past. Great. Well, I've learned this evening that Esri is about to sign off on a contract for a fourth. So I hope you enjoy this evening's conversation and enjoy us in several months for another one. We're excited to continue this important dialogue. It's now my pleasure to welcome my friend and our sponsor this evening, Ben Conklin, the Director of Defense Intelligence of Esri, to the stage. Thanks.
Oh, actually, let me maneuver past this setup here. All right, good evening. Thanks for coming. So actually, by the show of hands, it looks like a lot of you are at this event for the first time. So this is really great to see you all here. So just so you know a little bit about us, I'm, as you said, Ben Conklin from Esri. I manage our defense and intelligence industry strategy and our solutions that we build. What that means is I look to the future and look forward about how our software and how our technology is going to be used and where we see ourselves being positioned in the industry and help with kind of outbound communication and tradecraft in the defense and intelligence community. And we've been sponsoring these panels for the last few months now, and there's a reason for that. So we really see the kind of biggest disruption happening today, especially in the defense intelligence community, and kind of all of our customers across many different industries, as really being around this area of kind of AI and machine learning. And even to the point where that statement itself can be somewhat controversial. Is it augmentation? Is it, what is it? What is it we're really talking about? And what we're really talking about is something that we've all been seeing happening for a long time, which is this kind of digital transformation, getting all of our information digitized, sensing data from sensors out in the field, collecting data in many different forms, having it come in structured ways where we can do analysis on it. And the reality is that's created this flood of data that our analysts can't keep up with. So in doing this series, we really thought about it, to begin with. We talked a lot about that idea of what does it mean to be a human-machine team. And interestingly enough, as a software company, and I think as technology people, we dove right into the technology. We're like, oh, this is the technology, this is the potential of the technology and how great the technology is going to be. And we were reminded at the end of the session that it's the human-machine team. It can't just be the technology, right? There's got to be the people on the other end of it. So then we got to hear from really amazing analysts talking about how powerful their analysis can be, but also how far we have to come. What's the next step for us? What's the next place in the journey? And I think in some ways they put a little bit of a tamper on, we're still not there yet. The hype, the excitement's definitely there. We see the value being there, but it's not used in a daily practice yet. This is something we're still exploring and developing. And every day there's new promise. And so that was encouraging and somewhat discouraging. But I think we see that convergence of the technology and the people and the data happening, and it's occurring. And in some ways, it's happening at a really fast pace in some areas, and it's slowed down in other areas. But it's happening, and it's kind of inevitable. And just from a purely national security perspective, it's important that we stay at the front of that, all of us collectively, which is why we want to have these talks here together in this group. But at the end of the day, what I think the realization, fundamentally, if you look at the strategies and look at the future, the realization is that in order to make it happen, there's things that are going to have to change. And those changes might be technology, but I think there's plans for that. That's happening. Industries working together. Things are being integrated. The technology is moving rapidly forward through commercial investment and investment by the government. But more importantly, we do have to think about the future workforce and what the future workforce is all about. This isn't the only reason for this. It's not just about AI and machine learning. But if you think about a digital future and you think about the idea of needing a workforce of digital natives to come in and be part of your community, we all have to think about it differently, and I think it's a huge challenge. So I'd say on the industry side, we're challenged in this as much as government might be. Government has advantages, industry has advantages, but I think we're all challenged in this idea is how do we have this workforce of the future? If you just go out online and try to find a job as a AI engineer, machine learning engineer, data scientist, et cetera, you're going to be inundated with offers. You're going to get flooded with offers. There's lots of great opportunities out there. And every company is really stretched to the limit of trying to hire these people. And again, government's going to have the same challenge. So I think what we want to see and what we're hoping these kind of conversations help with is this convergence of how do we improve the technology, how do we take our existing analysts and give them the skills they need, how do we hire that workforce of the future, and how do we build the sustainable future of leveraging this technology. It's not going to be about less people. Computers aren't taking our jobs, right? It's about the idea of how do we harness the technology correctly, how do we build in a plan for the future, and how do we make this all come together? And I think we're going to continue that theme in future panels. If anybody here is interested, we'd love to collaborate with you on ideas for the next topics. What do you think is important? What burning issue have we not addressed? What should we revisit because it's changed so fast? So please come talk to me after this if you'd want to discuss ideas for that or ways you might contribute. But with that, we're going to bring up some of our great panelists and get going. So back to you, Danielle.
Ben, I really want to thank you for your support, and I really appreciate you explaining to everybody why you're supporting this event series. And to our good friends at INSA, thanks for helping with the programming. So before I invite them to the stage, let me thank and acknowledge our distinguished guests this evening. We have with us Kevin Keaton, Chief of Innovation at the National Security Agency, Dr. Charles Clancy, Executive Director of Virginia Tech's Hume Center for National Security and Technology, and Dr. Charlene Stokes, Director for Human Machine Social Systems Lab at MITRE. And our moderator this evening is Patrick Tucker. He is the Defense One technology editor. Oh, did we mess somebody up?
Wiley.
Oh, I don't have it. I'm sorry. Oh, my apologies. Here, help me take this. Sorry.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela. All right, everybody have a seat. And I'm Patrick Tucker, Technology Editor with Defense One. And I'm going to have everybody on the panel go down, very briefly say who you are and a quick sentence of why you're here on this planet. We're going to get to Neil Wiley, who's also from DIA. We're going to have a lot of questions about the future of artificial intelligence and human-machine teaming as it relates to the intelligence community, as it relates to the military, as it relates to privacy and life on this planet and the way you interact with all of your devices and all of your future devices. It's an area that we've been exploring for months and every one of these conversations yields a lot of new insight and surprises me a lot in terms of all the ways that I hadn't thought about this topic, which is so essential to the future of the way we interact with basically everything in our environment and with one another. So after we have some introductions, I'm going to have some questions. Before too long, I'm going to send it out to you. Hopefully you've had a drink or two, and you're going to feel chatty. Please feel forward and bold with your questioning. It's not a usual thing that folks in the intelligence community want to sit down and have a conversation about the future. So this is a wonderful opportunity. Again, I can't thank you enough. So with that, if everybody would really quickly tell us who you are and in a sentence or two why you're here today. Starting with you, Kevin.
I think you probably shouldn't give me such latitude to answer that question. Someone was harassing me aggressively to come to this panel, but so I'm Kevin Keaton. I'm the Chief of Innovation at NSA, and one of the things that intrigued me about this particular panel is the use, of ML in an applicable operational way. And so I'm happy to talk about that with the group. And just to be clear, there's like reporters in the room and stuff, so you might see me be a little hesitant and think through my answers a bit more than other people that work in an unclassified environment.
So my name is Charles Clancy. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech, where I serve as the executive director of the Hume Center for National Security and Technology. I actually started my career at the National Security Agency, and I spent a decade there trying to apply artificial intelligence to the SIGINT mission and being frustrated by the tools available at the time. I've now been at Virginia Tech for 9 years, where I lead a program there, and AI is a big part of a lot of the research that we're doing.
Hi, I'm Neil Wiley. I'm the other guy. Analysis, not enough of it. Need some from what's his name? Yeah, so I'm the director of analysis at the Defense Intelligence Agency. So I think I'm the odd person out here in not being technical nor having a PhD. Python to me is a snake. So, so that's where I am. So my existential and fundamental interest in this is in the practical application of artificial intelligence, machine learning, machine-assisted analytics, computational analytics, whatever you want to call it today, into the all-source analytic stream of a major intelligence agency in support of the Defense Department. So, and that takes an awful lot of time and consideration.
Hello, Charlene Stokes. Very excited to be here, especially because with Ben's opening remarks focusing on the human. So I think we'll all say maybe we're the odd man out. I am not on the technological side. I am a social scientist. I have a dual PhD in human factor psychology and industrial organizational psychology. And events such as these are popping up more and more, and I've been doing this for 14 years now with a background in trust and autonomous systems, and have always been talking about the human in that element. And more now with the rise of AI, but the realization has been said in the opening remarks, the important about the human element in that and how that dynamic is changing. So I'm really excited to have this audience here to be able to share my thoughts on the human side of that.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Thank you again so much, everybody, for being here, and thank all of you for being here, too. So one of the things that's come up in our discussions about this over the last few months, a key issue in the intelligence community and its embrace of both machine learning and artificial intelligence is how do you, in intelligence, begin to trust the outputs of any machine learning process. It's one thing if you're a stockbroker or you're working in exchanges and the output is something that you make a trade on. The cost-benefit analysis there is very clear. You can lose the money that you exchange. That's it. In the intelligence community, the cost-benefit analysis of making a trade or an action based on a machine-learned output is rather higher. And so the accountability question is rather greater. So I'd like to ask both Neil and Kevin, Kevin first, how you're creating human accountability and trust in machine learning outputs. And for Neil, how are you learning, or what is your challenge in trusting new intelligence products that have a big machine learning component? How do you do that? Go ahead, Kevin.
So this is one we struggle with. So context for most, we actually tend to have the analyst that authors the report put their name on the bottom. Mm-hmm. Now, that creates a very high level of accountability. Because when a customer then has a question about the veracity and other things about it, there's usually a phone call, because right next to your name is supposed to be a phone number. So when you then want to have high confidence in your answer, you then want to swim upstream right back to the source of the data and the context in which that data was collected, so that you can have high confidence in the report you put out. One of the things when we first started doing machine learning was, really having to educate many analysts between the difference between, causation and correlation. So I'm not sure how many have heard the bad story about there's 100% correlation between ice cream eating and drownings. And that's true, by the way. If you look at the stats, it's right there. It's a perfect thing. But it's not ice cream eating, it's summer. And you have to figure out what is it that's actually causing the outcome that you're noticing. Or you just talk about that we see only this outcome and we want to make, and we're not quite sure what the cause is. So we spend a lot of time on training our analytic cadre to understand the difference of what the machine is telling them, the context in which they should take it and do their own research. And then one of the other bigger challenges for us to be able to keep the state of some of the systems that generated an answer that led to a report. We have some policy that requires us to keep the data that led to a report, so someone can Monday morning quarterback when something usually when something goes wrong, and then be able to assess whether the training and activities and procedures that were used were consistent with good standard. How do we do that with the machine learning, which literally sometimes if you put the same information in twice, but on 2 different days, you'll get a slightly different answer. And so again, trying to have the right level of consistency to meet our threshold of trust is a non-trivial challenge. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you've really gotten to the heart of the challenge with your first question, so congratulations. So we do have some machine-assisted analytics and algorithmic-based assessment tools running now, live. So that question is very real. In my opinion, the ultimate value proposition for the intelligence community is somebody on whose decision may depend great political, economic, and indeed in our business, human consequence, is their trust in us that when we provide an intelligence assessment, that assessment has been generated with integrity and probity. And it is not misleading, it does not attempt to manipulate, it does not shape, it does not do anything other than inform to the best way we can to enable the best decision that decision maker can make. Now that trust matters whether that's a manual assessment or a machine-derived assessment or some hybrid thing from the human-machine team. So intelligence community tradecraft standards, particularly since the Iraq WMD Commission, have been weighted very heavily in order not to be misleading and to be very transparent and clear about the basis on which those assessments were made, and most importantly, the confidence in which we have confidence we have in our assessments. The same thing is true, in my view, for machine-generated assessments, right? You don't get off the hook just because it's a machine and we have a hard time doing some of those things. So for us, at least, we look at the development of algorithmic analytic tools. It's not like rapid tech development where you build fast, do fast, fail fast. It's more like pharmaceuticals, where the pharmaceutical company is developing something that the risk of its use is borne by the consumer, right? And the same thing is true with intelligence. The risk of our intelligence is actually borne by the people who act on it. So we go through a series of what effectively look like clinical trials, large scale and small scale, on these things, so we understand how it works. And at the end of the day, we don't have to have complete confidence in what it does. We have to be able to capture the confidence we have in its outputs.
Okay.
Because again, with a human assessment, there's uncertainty and they're all over the place now.
Right.
So that's no different with machines. You have to be able to capture it. So I'll issue an authority to operate to these systems as long as I am satisfied that they comport with fundamental tradecraft standards. And a lot of times it's feeling your way through there, but at that point, the analysts understand how to use it, the decision makers know what they do.
Do you feel like uncertainty is going up or down as you continue to integrate machine learning into your tradecraft?
That's a good question, and I don't know.
Okay.
I think the ways in which uncertainty manifests itself are becoming larger, right? Because the more different sources of information you integrate into that assessment, and by the way, that's a good thing, right? In the all-source world, it's ethically good to consider the largest number of amount of potentially available information to you in your assessment. The more different types of information you integrate, and the more techniques and tools vary to do it, I think that the sources of uncertainty actually add up.
Yeah. Okay, that's terrifying.
Hold on a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there are all sorts of ways to take that one. So I'm going to do this and then at some level get some of the rest of us discussing this one. But the larger the data set and the more diverse the inputs in that data set and effective use of machine learning can really decrease ambiguity, or you can be really suspicious and think that everybody's trying to give you bad data and they're just really, really good at it, which you have to always weigh both of those. But higher first principles for us is, the only way on the SIGINT side, there's also the information assurance side of NSA and the cyber defense side, but the we either, on the SIGINT side, we either have to know something that the adversary doesn't think we know, derive data from the data we have that the adversary doesn't think we can get to, or do it so fast that we're inside the adversary's OODA loop. So for us, machine learning is absolutely critical to do those, and some cases we'll have more uncertainty because the linkage we have for the data elements is weak, but if true, is such a high impact that the customer will take the decision, and as long as we are transparent about our confidence level and how we got it, we feel ethically clean in that discussion.
That's
Can you
absolutely
can you give me an example?
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. That's why, to me, it's important that we can capture the uncertainty clearly and consistently. Not that it's always a high confidence thing, right? Low confidence assessment, at the right time in the right place is perfectly good.
Yeah. Well, so on this, let me turn to Charles and also Charlene for a second, because you touched on something that's really at the core of right now a lot of the anticipation and the hype surrounding artificial intelligence and machine learning, particularly in intelligence and national security, and that's getting left of bang, right? Creating anticipatory insights that's going to allow you to get a window into a situation, whether it's with an adversary, whether it's geopolitical, et cetera, far in advance of that situation having relevance and being public. So I wonder, Charles, this is something that you've looked at a little bit, and it's an area where at one point in 2012, when everybody was using Facebook, Twitter, and a variety of other social media platforms, basically without skepticism and contributing enormously to an open source corpus of their daily lives, there was a ton of data that you could use to infer insights. And that situation has somewhat changed. So in terms of creating anticipatory intelligence, I would love you, Kevin, as well as you, Neil, to comment on this if you can. But Charles, what is the state of the art right now in that?
So it's been an interesting probably 5-6 years in anticipatory analytics. As many of you may know, anticipatory analytics has been a major thrust of IARPA, one of the R&D arms of the intelligence community, and Virginia Tech has participated in several of the major programs in that area. The early one was the Open Source Indicators program that was very much focused on leveraging social media and other public and commercially available data sources to try and forecast the news in South America. That was the initial region. And it was really interesting to see, essentially we had people hand coding what happened in the news. There were people who read the newspapers of the region and came up with these coded records of, we had a political protest, it did not become violent, these were the actors behind it, this was the region, the location of the event, right? And it was all very, very itemized. And so you had this large amount of training data. And so if you look at how would you predict the future with that sort of data, while also bringing in a lot of open source and commercially available data sets, we saw that, you know what, you could get 80% of the answer by just guessing that in month X, the same thing was going to happen that happened in month X minus 1. Right, and so there was a strong correlation, particularly in events where you had a lot of activity, areas where you had a lot of activity. It became extremely challenging, though, to identify the improbable and infrequent events, because you didn't have large volumes of data that would allow you to do that. We had the experience actually to extend this research more recently into the classified realm and apply these same techniques to classified data sets. And it was really hard, right? The discussion here is the human-machine team, and this program was saying, okay, there's no human. There's just Skynet. It must consume large amounts of data and predict the future. And the conclusion was it's not there yet. We had, again, the best thing, 90% of the answer was just predict what happened the last month. And so there's a long way to go in terms of dealing with this sort of unsupervised, human not in the loop learning. And so I think at least for the next 5 years, bringing the human into that team and being able to curate models and bring experts into developing the signatures and profiles is going to be critically important.
Yeah, that was such a great setup. I would love to add to that in terms of bringing the human into that loop, right? So for me, again, coming from as a psychologist, an experimental psychologist in particular, I came from the human-centered ISR division working, and we did this just eye-opening study, right, where we were doing a Wizard of Oz study, which is essentially simulating, it sounds like, the research you're actually doing, right, and these tools and these abilities of artificial intelligence, machine learning of the future, right, and what does that look like? This was about 5 years ago we did this, right? So again, that's the foundation, right? We need to get that right, and folks such as yourself working so hard to get that right, and that trustworthiness of that system itself is so critical. But then the human comes on top of that, and that was exactly what this study was investigating, using experienced PedCell analysts. And depending on how we presented that scenario to them, that it was this trustworthy system, presenting them with these recommendations, and how I introduced that system as a tool or a teammate. Was this just a system giving them a decision aid recommendation, pulling all this data, all source analysts, all different aspects coming in at them, again, this vision of the future, again, experienced analysts going through this exercise I had set up for them, versus a teammate, giving it a name, humanizing this system. They trusted and reacted on those decisions, all about how I set that up. So there's this additional degree of variance that I think is woefully lacking in empirical evidence. And to your earlier question, it is an empirical question, right? In terms of where we're going to go with that. What's the trustworthiness, the trust of it, the uncertainty, right? I think there's so much that needs to happen that folks that are doing at Virginia Tech on the system itself, but again, woefully lacking on the human response to how these systems and trying to understand that.
All right. So you do a lot of work on biosensing, right, and other areas of where, and this is fascinating to me because this is kind of the future of the way we're going to interface with a lot of different devices, and theoretically the way that we interface with potentially cars, or if you want to equipment, things like this, we give away a lot of biophysical signals that can be useful in creating new software that's going to partner with us much better. And so I wonder if you could tell me really quickly, what are some of the most important literal signals that are going to play a role in that in the future? I can think of the way I explicitly say things and explicit commands that I give, but the future of human-machine interface is a lot more than that. It's a lot more than what I'm consciously doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it's not that there's what are the good signals, it's how many signals can you get. The multimodal assessment aspect, and to go back to some of some of the commentary earlier about 80% or whatever it was right, but sometimes it comes down to the gut feeling of the analyst. And what that gut feeling ultimately is data. That's our sensory system operating at a level of unconsciousness that we're not realizing that we're taking in all this massive amount of data and responding to it. We call it a gut feeling because we don't understand the brain fully, right? And we may never, right? But again, that's what it is. So the more sources of information, essentially that perceptual system that you can feed into, then your machine partner, in this case, right, with a multimodal assessment and biometrics and different aspects that they're connecting and having that team, because again, we're having this dialogue. We're sending so many different signals beyond just the verbal signals, right? So I would say it's how much information can you increase in terms of sharing with those systems and having those systems learn and react and respond.
Let me turn to Kevin. First of all, and also Neil, is that something at all that in your agencies you're interested in looking at, is how non-explicit exchanges between human beings and software and how that can enable the creation of a better product? It's something that the Air Force is very interested in because you put people in planes and they have to interact with the planes in a very specific way. Is there any room for that in more stationary forms of national security activity? Because you were sort of... No, it seems like, no, you're not even worried about it. Yeah.
Shot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they just passed over the question that I don't have a good answer for.
Yeah.
So there might well be, actually, I was very interested in that exchange that just happened because I haven't considered it.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's one of the things that we're looking at now in terms of how we interact with machines, but it may well in the future be a pretty lucrative area.
Well, let me unless you have an answer.
I think I'll go off the literal on this one. So I'm not aware of any, I'll say, research that we're doing to harness analyst-to-analyst interaction to then put into the system.
Yeah.
But certainly the analyst will then translate that interaction and put different things into the system.
Yeah.
So we're not looking at the observables, we're waiting for the analyst to make a determination as to what part of that conversation or interaction with the customer and other analyst or a boss would be appropriate to put back into the system to get value back to the rest of the analytic community. So I'm not aware that we're doing that. Now, watching people interact with systems, yes, lots of work done on that. What kind of questions they ask, what was the precursor that gets that analyst to answer that question, what precursors cause other analysts to ask the similar question. Let's see if we can automate that portion of the process to get them the information that they're likely to ask for next, and then see what level of accuracy that is and get some feedback from the analyst.
Is there any concern that, here, I'll put it over here. Is there any concern that you might be overwhelming analysts with too much data that they can make sense of right now? And do you feel like there's a machine learning cure for that? Or do you feel like machine learning in the way it can automate the collection of data is only going to exacerbate that problem?
So we've already reached data inundation, right? Anybody who's an analyst out there practicing now without being swamped with a whole lot of additional data knows that already an analyst is always time constrained, whether they're writing a national intelligence estimate that has a gestation period of a year, or whether they've got to do a spot report that has a gestation period of 5 minutes. They'll always work under a time constraint. So while we say we do all source analysis, we do as many sources as are relevant that we can get to at the right time. And that's true today. The additional data now in the public domain, as well as the large classified holdings, really means that we just don't get to it.
Yeah.
We're not overwhelmed by it, we just don't even consider it. And from an ethical standpoint, that's why human-machine teaming is so necessary for the all-source analytic process, simply to bring under consideration this information. I do believe that there's actually a machine learning, AI, I don't want to say solution, nothing's ever solved, but ability to mitigate this problem, right? Because that's the whole point of doing it, is to bring a lot of this material that otherwise would go utterly unconsidered into some consideration with a machine partner and a teammate that actually makes you recommendations, suggestions after having considered a whole bunch of other additional materials. So I think that's actually very fertile ground.
I just add on to that one. So yes, analysts have access to far more data than a human can consume. That's a given. Have you met the internet? Right. I mean, I think all of us can experience that in a real world way. Just pick up your phone right now. The question is, does it overwhelm that analyst's responsibility to do their primary job? And a lot that is nuanced in that answer is what kind of tradecraft are they using to execute their particular function? In many cases, I can look at what they did yesterday, automate that, and present triage set of data to them that will hopefully optimize the time that they have to work on the challenge. But then to counter that I'm only looking for what I knew about yesterday, I have to have a separate set of analysts looking for brand new stuff that we weren't looking at yesterday to make sure we aren't continuing to go down a path that is going to be a box canyon in the not too distant future. So for us, the balance is to make sure we have people doing more unknown or known unknown analysis, if you get my Rumsfeld references, while I have the majority of our analysts doing known analysis, right? These are known targets using known, in our case, technologies, because there's a set of customers that absolutely have a compelling reason to know a lot about that particular target.
Okay.
So I think it might be helpful to think about this in the context of really the intelligence production process. So you collect intelligence. There's lots and lots of data. You need to suck it in and process it. You need to then begin to make sense of it. You then need to turn that into analytic output. And so as you look at each of those stages, the volume of the data and the shape of the data is very different. And so at the early stage, you're coping with huge amounts of data coming off of any number of sensors. And so there's a really interesting opportunity for machine learning to help us do the shoeboxing there up front, help us decide what data is important, what data to save, what data to send back to headquarters, what data to flag for someone's attention, right? And there's a lot of work happening in that space. I think when you think about it in the context of human-machine teaming, there's then the question of how the human curates those models, and it's much more complex than just targeting. Yeah. Right now, you have a selector of a bad guy you want to find. In this world, it's a little bit different, right? It's more about curating a model. Right, so then as you move into the middle stage, it's you get more into this. You've got a set of machine learning AI-based tools that an analyst is using to go through all this data that they've collected. It helps them prioritize the data, triage the data, identify the things that they should be looking at. And then as you get even further into the process, then it's really, well, what does all this mean? How do we develop a report based on it? And so that's where the AI is the least mature in terms of taking that and drawing some conclusion from it. But as you see, right now we have a lot of the AI emphasis is on the front end in order to deal with the large volumes of data, which is what AI is really good at.
Right.
But we need to figure out how to build the team at all three stages between the algorithms and the people.
Yeah. So questions. We've got to have some questions over here from the audience. Okay, here we go. Right up here in front. Hold on. I think we've got a microphone for you. Hold on one second. There you go. Yeah.
We'll use the microphone.
Yeah, there you go. And also if you could say your name and your affiliation would be helpful.
Yeah, so I'm Henry Hotlett. I'm with Technology Ventures Limited.
Okay.
The question I have is, in the future, I think people in the intelligence community know about the Microsoft HoloLens contract with the goggles and the, emergence of sort of geo-based, decisioning. Mm-hmm. What I'm wondering is, in the future, is there a focus on AI helping play games for the purpose of combat and, basically have AI help with strategy decisions? Sort of game playing, right?
Does anyone want to try and tackle that? I have an answer if no one else does.
I mean, I think this has been happening for decades. Certainly, War Games, my favorite movie from 1982, is based on that fundamental premise, right? So I think we've been using computers for analyzing complex strategic scenarios for a long time. I think the environment we're in now, the state space of those scenarios has increased significantly because we're not just considering the Soviet Union as the primary interaction point. And so, again, a much more complex environment, and we have much more sophisticated machine learning tools that are able to interact with those environments as well. So I personally am not aware of some big program that's looking to accomplish that, but I think the tools are beginning to emerge that's an interesting area for study.
There's a couple of programs that are sort of looking at that. So the thing that you just referenced, the Microsoft HoloLens, the U.S. Army has a big interest in this right now, and they actually have a contract with Microsoft to develop what's on a heads-down display. It's basically a helmet you put on, you look through it, it takes an inventory of objects in your environment, and then it feeds that data back. And a huge part of the purpose of that program is actually to help soldiers that go through an experience, some sort of combat situation, go back and role play how that experience went so then they can refine their own performance in that. So it's in terms of a tactical front-end application, it's very much what the United States Army is interested in for distributed infantry. When you get to these higher-end strategic goals, that's something that people have been talking about wanting to do in terms of decision-aided product for a very long time, but it remains really elusive because humans are, you can't gamify that. We're 8 billion human beings that respond chaotically depending on a lot of different factors. So it's very different at that high strategic level, coming up with decision aids that perform as well as everybody wants them to perform. Charlene, you had a question? No, okay. Here we go. Question right here. Yes, and please, we've got a mic coming for you.
Hi, Isabella Copey, Lockheed Martin. So, as I'm just beginning to explore AI as an Intel analyst, I'm kind of wondering, it's not only the system learning from you, you are learning how to communicate with a system in a very specific way to get it to answer your questions. Do you predict that method of communication may impact the way humans interact with each other in the intelligence community moving forward as AI expands?
So I have an interesting anecdote along these lines. So there's, of course, the IC version of Watson, right? The Jeopardy playing interface, right? And the idea is an analyst can express a natural language question to this thing, and it will answer it based on classified data. And I have a close friend who has personal experience with this, and she attempted to enter a Boolean query into IC Watson, and IC Watson said, well, what is this, right? I'm a natural language interface. And so there's great examples of where over the last decade or more than that, people have learned how to work with very logic-driven tools, and now they're being given these natural language interfaces and don't know how to react. And so as we think about long-term how these two things are going to work together, the analysts and the machines, that's a key question.
Yeah, I obviously can't help but, just iterate that again. Absolutely. And again, it's being neglected, and it's being neglected and not appreciated at such an early stage in our children and their development, growing up and interacting with these kind of systems and how that's happening. And there's been an interesting bystander research into the trust and autonomous systems, how there's a human partner interacting with the system, and depending on their level of trust impacts the bystander's level of trust. And again, some interesting empirical research in that regard. But I think we, especially those that have children, can all just see how it's fundamentally shifting and our way of interacting with those systems, and what we're learning and how we're changing our behavior is just dramatic. And I think there just needs to be more attention paid to that. And we need to, and I'll just get on my podium for a moment and footstop the need that we need to bring the research world and the applied world much closer together, right? Because technology is happening and developing at such a rapid pace, and we can't be researching these fascinating developmental psychology aspects that are happening with our youth and then up through the ages without kind of coming closer to what technology and how things are being applied today. So the more that we can bring those worlds together in terms of more fundamental research and in applied settings, I think can help answer some of those questions.
So I absolutely think it'll change. And what leads me to believe that is my experience with my 25-year-old son, who I was always wondering why I was always annoyed with him. and there you go. And there were a whole litany of reasons I went through, right? But I realized finally the reason it is because he had a completely different experiential and social view of interacting with a piece of technology, in that people who were virtually present to him were actually present to him. Whereas at my age, to me, people in the room have a higher social status than people at the other end of ones and zeros.
We're very fortunate for that. Thank you.
Yeah, but to my son, it clearly does not. He affords the people on the other end of the machine, unless he's just a real jerk and no one else acts like this. But so that's an example of how different interactions, technology change how you deal with other people, and I think that will be the same in the workplace.
And I'll just add on to this one, but I'm not aware of any system that you use regularly that doesn't teach you how to use it. I mean, there's ways to optimize the use of almost anything, and eventually if you're going to use it often enough, you're going to shift to optimize for the behavior and the outcome you're looking for by interfacing with the machine efficiently. I have had multiple conversations with my children using only text to language, right? All acronyms, and even some of the acronyms are pretty weak. And we can still have an effective conversation. Now I do that because it's more efficient for me to type in 3 letters than to type in 20 letters. And I can still convey the information effectively. And that's just one small sample. If you're working 8 hours a day on one system, you are absolutely going to figure out how to get to the outcome you want the most efficiently. And then if several of you are doing it, the group dynamics require you to start talking in the way that makes the most sense for people using that same system. Right. So the counter to this, or the big thing to be aware of, is that means when you go and ask those users what they want, they usually tell you something slightly better than what they currently have. It's very challenging to find someone that can really step back and take a look at what the broader activity is to see if we can do something fundamentally different. The number of times I've pushed back on user requirements that when I sniffed at it, I was like, that doesn't sound like a real requirement. That just sounds like it's what they're biased at what they've been doing for a while. That's one of the ways that language filters through and can impact billions of dollars of investment unless you're kind of aware of that to figure out what the larger picture is. So be aware of that all the time. It's a great thing to be aware of. It also creates we as humans really want to have inside baseball. It creates groups, it creates unique languages amongst us because, nod, nod, wink, wink, we're all part of the same family. That's really, really useful in a lot of areas, but not so good when you're trying to figure out what do we want to do next, how to jump on the next curve. So just make sure you go get the benefit of it, but not as much of the downside.
I have a question for you, Kevin. It's related to something we talked about a little bit on the phone, and that's privacy, because you're at a really interesting intersection point where you can see trends in consumer technology, trends in digital technology, and I wonder if you can talk about how you feel artificial intelligence and machine learning is going to change privacy going forward, both for consumers, but also in terms of how you keep individual identity and anonymization and all of the different huge number of rules you have to follow in terms of personal identification, how machine learning potentially impacts those. Does it make your job easier or harder or what? And what are what's the meaning of this in terms of the broader digital community?
I'm not sure how to answer the 7 questions you just put in there, my friend. Let me try this portion, which is privacy is in the eye of the beholder, and that's a real awkward standard to meet every time. One of the concerns that we have, certainly on the information assurance side, is to make sure that if we are putting in data that needs to be protected, but the machine learning algorithm needs the raw data to produce a good outcome without exposing the data that was used to train it, that data leakage and then the bias that the machine learning will have based on the data you give it is something that we're very much are aware and conscious of and try and figure out how to mitigate. There are lots of times, let's just use an example, if I want to use classified data to train a system to work on unclassified data, is that still going to meet the policy thresholds that we have? And there's a whole lot of math that we can put behind certain of the algorithms, but the data leakage of a machine learning analytic is non-trivial and usually not one of the things that the inventor of the algorithm put a lot of thought into when they were designing it. So how do you then encapsulate it in the right way and how do you manage it? On the other side, I mean, from a public thing, you might want to consider the digital dust or digital exhaust, or use your analogy of your choice, on how the banners come in. I'm assuming most people use free email services. How those banners come in and those ads come in with something that's actually kind of relevant to what I've been looking at over the last couple of weeks. It's not magic. It's machine learning on large-scale data using multiple data sources, and they're incentivized to get as accurate as possible because if you click on it, they get paid more. So how do we make sure that from that perspective we can do that better in the classified data that we have to provide unique value that shows maybe what the target's intent is based on a series of behaviors and digital dust that they're leaving. So on the outside, I want privacy. I want my kids to have privacy, right? If you want to do a lookup on me, I'm a big black hole other than events like this on the internet. I don't have any social media presence. That's a conscious decision on my part.
Right.
It keeps me away from certain things that I probably benefit from, but it's a conscious decision to make those ads a little less effective for me. But that, when you start talking about privacy, it's in the eye of the beholder, and how do you make sure you meet that? Usually I get a privacy conversation as a Monday morning quarterback conversation.
Right.
When I say I mean National Security Agency. And those are usually, my bad analogy on this, when you're explaining, you're losing. So we try not to get into those kind of explaining conversations as much as possible, but to say that if you're trying to keep anonymous, you're trying to keep data private, GDPR, HIPAA, and other things are really, I believe, pushing private industry closer to what the kind of compliance regime we have inside the agency.
Okay.
And I think we're going to be able to benefit from some of the industry investment in that kind of compliance regime on the inside.
That's surprising and reassuring. Other questions? Here we go, right here in front.
I'm Joe Radek. I'm in program management and been in IT since '67. So I've seen the morphing of the capabilities of this resource called information, and I resolved it to the capabilities of two things. It can create it and it can destroy it. Now, K through 12 is very important to set a foundation for where we as a culture are going to go with the use of information, its utility, and how we're going to approach it in the future. There's two tracks, like I said. There's both the create and the destroy. Now, creating that balance is definitely going to require some level of policy making from our, quote, leadership and I think it's going to be a global issue going forward. So the question I would have is, what balance would you guys, ladies, take as far as the balance between the ability to create and destroy using information that comes from data that clearly major corporations have already collected? So what kind of balance and focus do we want to have going forward as a country? And your input would be very valuable, because this is going to be a major issue that we're going to have control over. Okay?
Right. So I guess it sort of gets back to that. Is the management of stuff getting better or worse in terms of the volume of data and the amount of stuff that we have? Is it our ability to manage it improving, or is the stream getting so broad that it defies easy management and therefore thus would bias towards destroy? I don't know. Anyone want to try? Okay. I think you stumped them. Yeah. It's a larger sort of philosophical issue, and we have so something to talk about over more drinks. But any other questions before we go? Oh, here we go, right here. Yeah.
Rob Wall, Basis Technology. In terms of training the analytic workforce, we've talked about the generation gap in terms of comfortability with technology and a different way of communicating. And to the extent that cognitive bias is generally resultant of the parity between expectation and observation over time, doesn't it also stand to reason that your more experienced analysts are going to be less comfortable with or more skeptical about AI than more junior analysts who may have greater comfortability with technology? And if so, how do you combat the over-bias against AI as you develop new capabilities and try to introduce them into the analyst workflow?
Well, Neil's just going to fire them, right? I mean,
Yeah, so this is a lot of what we think about. So I think the first thing is to go back to first principles of what an analyst actually needs to be. And because we get a lot of questions about, analysts will be different, they'll need completely different training. Okay, some differences in there. But we bias heavily towards difference in weighting things, right? So differences are more important than similarities. So I always find it useful to go back and find out what is constant for analysts all the time. They need grammar, logic, rhetoric, intellectual curiosity, the ability to work well in teams and play well with others, personal integrity, and intellectual humility. That is necessary for an analyst in any portfolio. Now, there are additional technical skills that overlay on that portfolio to portfolio. But one way or another, whether I'm hiring a 23-year-old or whether I'm trying to develop somebody who's a very senior analyst, if you don't have that basic portfolio of capabilities, you will be a good something, but you probably won't be a good intelligence analyst. There is a degree of receptivity for computational analytics that we find in the younger hires, and we count on that, actually. Because I expect some greater degree of computational numeracy to simply come in with a younger demographic. That's good. That's necessary. The best analytic outcomes, in my experience, are done where you have teams with diverse viewpoints. So you have people who are older, you have people who have functional backgrounds, you have people with regional backgrounds, you have younger people bring different skills, because taken together, you will get a better outcome than you will if you simply selected a group that's narrower. So the challenge for us as leadership, as we bring these kind of generational changes in on technology, is to make the best use we can of everybody who's on the field. Whether that's the older analysts, the younger analysts, it doesn't matter. We create the teams and we create the process that gives you a good outcome, and we don't rely on an individual or a demographic to carry that water. And there's cultural developments that have to happen on both sides. Everybody's got learning to do, but that's okay. That's the business.
Charlene, you had a question?
Yeah, I'll just comment. I think because your question actually ties nicely to the first gentleman's question as well, in terms of First and foremost, so I will say as a scientist, it's always an empirical question, right? But what we're seeing in some of the data and some of the more recent studies coming out, whereas the more traditional switch was the more experience and the older, the less you trust some of these types of systems, right? But now what we're seeing, of course, the digital youth coming up, right? They're more likely to trust that. So again, there's this whole generational shift that's happening, and to the gentleman's point earlier, it is such a larger issue that it will take some very significant policy changes that need to trickle down to then the education and the training ultimately for analysts and for everybody. It is such a huge institutional and societal norm shift. Any name you call it, most go by the fourth industrial revolution at this point, but what we're actually experiencing right now is a dramatic shift in our institutional and societal norms that take these huge policy shifts, and we're seeing them play out and manifest in such as the analyst cadre and different folks such as that. But again, we need to take it back and start understanding and be more proactive about some of the way we approach some of these trainings, and again, take it ultimately back to the K through 12 as well.
And I'll give a plug for MITRE's Gen AI program, which is one of the few programs that's actually trying to do this and really push that curriculum down.
Workplace issues. What's your main workplace challenge right now in terms of training?
Related to ML.
Yeah.
Actually understanding the limitations. Well, for us, a data scientist isn't just a computer scientist relabeled. It's a person that has an understanding of the limitations and the ambiguities in the data they're processing, and the limitations, the ambiguities of the analytic they're running against. If you don't know those two, you're probably not going to have a pretty good trusted outcome. So we spend a lot of time making sure people actually understand, like on the SIGINT side, we have a highly biased data set. Yeah. It's one of the most highly biased data sets in the world. So saying well, we need to run it across a lot of data. Well, if it's a lot of biased data, it's probably going to be a biased result. So you have to know that going in so that you have a context for understanding the value of what's coming out. Mm-hmm. So getting that kind of training into our folks from an entry-level language analyst to an SME target analyst that's been working at Target for 25 years and has an in-depth understanding, and at the unconscious level understands the motives of the target. Having them understand how to apply ML appropriately and all the limitations it brings is our training problem. And we have relationships with a lot of universities. We send people to go off work and go MOOC MOOC courses, and we also have a lot of internal training.
This is great. So to sort of wrap up here, the thing that actually protects and makes better intelligence products in a machine learning generated future is diversity among teammates to defeat cognitive bias, and a whole bunch of human skills that a lot of people would tell you are irrelevant are actually more relevant than ever. So that's part of the reason why we have this entire exchange, so that we remember that all of those skills that we think we can disregard actually become more and more into focus. And so with that, first of all, please stick around afterwards. We're going to have a little bit of time left for drinks, I'm told. So please continue to chit-chat. And please join me in thanking my panel for being here today.